dedicated to journalists whose persistence hunting the facts makes possible our democracy. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln asked his fellow Americans, "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws, and that we improve to the last, that we remained free to the last, that we revered his name to the last, that during his long sleep we permitted no hostile foot to pass over or desecrate his resting place, shall be that which to learn the last trump shall awaken our Washington." Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. System theorists coined an acronym to separate beguiling beliefs from real-world facts. Rather than being seduced by what a system is intended to do, they focus on what it in fact does. Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. Jonathan Chait, writing in New York Magazine, said, "The unfolding of the Russia scandal has been like walking into a dark cavern. Every step reveals that the cave runs deeper than we thought. And after each one, as we wonder how far it goes, our imaginations are circumscribed by the steps we have already taken. The cavern might go just a little farther, we presume, but probably not much farther. And since trying to discern the size and shape of the scandal is an exercise in uncertainty, we focus our attention on the most likely outcome, which is that the story goes a little deeper than what we have already discovered. But what if that's wrong? What if we are still standing closer to the mouth of the cave than the end?" Yuri Bezmenov was a Soviet journalist for RIA Novosti and a former KGB informant who defected to Canada. Mr. Bezmenov moved to Los Angeles in the early 1980s. In 1983, at a lecture in Los Angeles, Bezmenov expressed the opinion that he wouldn't be surprised if the Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 in order to kill Larry McDonald. In 1984, he gave an interview to G. Edward Griffin, titled "Soviet Subversion of the Free World Press," in which Bezmenov explained the methods used by the KGB for the gradual subversion of democracy in the United States. Well, you spoke before about ideological subversion, and that's a phrase I'm afraid some Americans don't understand.
When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place, and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people, and the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. They will join the links of dissenters, dissidents. Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world, that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with the benevolent dictator who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins. Never mind, he will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. The United States is in the state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. And the initiator of this war is not Comrade Andropov, of course. It's the system. However ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system or the world communist conspiracy, whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. This is it. This is the last country of freedom and possibility.
Okay, so what do we do? What is your recommendation to the American people? Well, the immediate thing that comes to mind is, of course, there must be a very strong national effort to educate people in the spirit of real patriotism, number one. Number two, to explain to them the real danger of socialist, communist, welfare state, big brother government. The moment at least part of the United States population is convinced that the danger is real, they have to force their government to stop aiding communism. In 1987, with assistance from the KGB, the top level of the Soviet diplomatic service arranged for Donald Trump and his wife to visit Moscow. This took place while Khrushchev was seeking to improve the KGB's operational techniques in one particular and sensitive area. The spy chief wanted KGB staff abroad to recruit more Americans. In addition to shifting politics in Moscow, Khrushchev's difficulty had to do with intelligence gathering. The results from KGB officers abroad had been disappointing. Too often, they would pretend to have obtained information from secret sources. In reality, they had recycled material from newspapers or picked up gossip over lunch with a journalist. Too many residencies had paper agents on their books, targets for recruitment who had nothing to do with real intelligence. Khrushchev sent out a series of classified memos to KGB heads of station. Oleg Gordievsky, formerly based in Denmark and then in Great Britain, copied them and passed them to British intelligence. He later co-published them with the historian Christopher Andrew under the title Comrade Khrushchev's Instructions, Top Secret Files on KGB Foreign Operations 1975 to 1985. In January 1984, Khrushchev addressed the problem during a biennial review held in Moscow and at a special conference 6 months later. The urgent subject, how to improve agent recruitment, the general urged his officers to be more creative. Previously, they had relied on identifying candidates who showed ideological sympathy toward the USSR, leftists, trade unionists, and so on. By the mid-1980s, these were not so many, so KGB officers should make bolder use of material incentives, money, and use flattery, an important tool. The center, as KGB headquarters was known, was especially concerned about its lack of success in recruiting U.S. citizens, according to Andrew and Gordievsky. The PR line, that is, the Political Intelligence Department stationed in KGB residences abroad, was given explicit instructions to find U.S. targets to cultivate or, at the very least, official contacts. The main effort must be concentrated on acquiring valuable agents, Khrushchev said. The memo, dated February 1, 1984, was to be destroyed as soon as its contents had been read. It is said that despite improvements in information gathering, the KGB has not had great success in operation against the main adversary, America. One solution was to make wider use of the facilities of friendly intelligence services, for example, Czechoslovakian or East German spy networks, and further improvement in operational work with agents calls for fuller and wider utilization of confidential and special unofficial contacts. These should be acquired chiefly among prominent figures in politics and society and important representatives of business and science. These should not only supply valuable information, but also actively influence a country's foreign policy in a direction of advantage to the USSR. There were, of course, different stages of recruitment. Typically, a case officer would invite a target to lunch. The target would be classified as an official contact. If the target appeared responsive, he, it was rarely she, would be promoted to a subject of deep study, Objekt Razrabokti. The officer would build up a file, supplemented by official and covert material. That might include readouts from conversations obtained through bugging by the KGB's technical team. The KGB also distributed a secret personality questionnaire, advising case officers what to look for in a successful recruitment operation. In April 1985, this was updated for prominent figures in the West. The director's aim was to draw the target into some form of collaboration with us. This could be as an agent, or confidential, or special or unofficial contact. The form demanded basic details: name, profession, family situation, and material circumstances. There were other questions, too. What was the likelihood that the subject would come to power, occupy the post of president or prime minister? And an assessment of personality. For example, are pride, arrogance, egoism, ambition, or vanity among subjects' natural characteristics? The most revealing section concerned compromise. The document asked for compromising information about subject, including illegal acts in financial and commercial affairs, intrigues, speculation, bribes, graft, and an exploitation of his position to enrich himself, plus any other information that would compromise the subject before the country's authorities and the general public. Naturally, the KGB could exploit this by threatening disclosure. Finally, his attitude towards women is also of interest. The document wanted to know, is he in the habit of having affairs with women on the side? When did the KGB open a file on Donald Trump? We don't know, but Eastern Bloc Security Service records suggest this may have been as early as 1977. That was the year when Trump married Ivana Zelnikova, a 28-year-old model from Czechoslovakia. Zelnikova was a citizen of a communist country. She was therefore of interest both to the Czech intelligence service, the STB, and to the FBI, the CIA, and even Barbara Walters. As Trump tells it, the idea for his first trip to Moscow came after he found himself seated next to the Soviet ambassador, Yuri Dubinin. This was in the autumn 1986. The event was a luncheon held by Leonard Lauder, the businessman son of Estee Lauder. Dubinin's daughter Natalia had read about Trump Tower and knew all about it, Trump said in his 1987 bestseller, The Art of the Deal. During the Soviet era, Russian intelligence cast a wide net to gain leverage over influential figures abroad. The practice continues to this day. The Russians would lure or entrap not only prominent politicians and cultural leaders, but also people whom they saw as having the potential for gaining prominence in the future. In 1986, Soviet Ambassador Yuri Dubinin met Donald Trump in New York, flattered him with praise for his building exploits, and invited him to discuss a building in Moscow. In 1987, just 3 years after he attended the closing with Mr. Trump, Bogatin pleaded guilty to taking part in a massive gasoline bootlegging scheme with Russian mobsters. After he fled the country, the government seized his 5 condos at Trump Tower, saying that Mr. Bogatin had purchased them to launder money, to shelter and hide assets. A Senate investigation into organized crime later revealed that Bogatin was a leading figure in the Russian mob in New York. His family ties, in fact, led straight to the top. Mr. Bogatin's brother ran the $150 million stock scam with none other than Semyon Mogilevich, whom the FBI considers the boss of bosses of the Russian mafia. At the time, Mogilevich, feared even by his fellow gangsters as the most powerful mobster in the world, was expanding his multi-billion-dollar international criminal syndicate into America. Trump continued, one thing led to another, and now I'm talking about building a large luxury hotel across the street from the Kremlin in partnership with the Soviet government. Trump's chatty version of events is incomplete. According to Natalia Dubinina, the actual story involved a more determined effort by the Soviet government to seek out Trump. In February 1985, Khrushchev complained again about the lack of appreciable results of recruitment against the Americans in most residencies. The ambassador arrived in New York in March 1986. His original job was Soviet ambassador to the United Nations. His daughter Dubinina was already living in the city with her family, and she was part of the Soviet UN delegation. Dubinin wouldn't have answered to the KGB, and his role wasn't formally an intelligence one. but he would have had close contacts with the power apparatus in Moscow. Mr. Dubinin enjoyed greater trust than other lesser ambassadors. Dubinin said she picked up her father at the airport. It was his first time in New York City. She took him on a tour. The first building they saw was Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. She told Komolskaya Pravda newspaper. Dubinin was so excited he decided to go inside to meet the building's owner. They got into the elevator. At the top, Dubinina said they met Trump. The ambassador, fluent in English and a brilliant master of negotiations, charmed the busy Trump, telling him, "The first thing I saw in the city is your tower." Dubinin said Trump melted at once. He is an emotional person, somewhat impulsive. He needs recognition. And of course, when he gets it, he likes it. My father's visit worked on him, Trump, like honey to a bee. This encounter happened 6 months before the Estee Lauder lunch. In Ms. Dubinin's account, she admits her father was trying to hook Trump. The man from Moscow wasn't a wide-eyed rube, but a veteran diplomat who served in France and Spain and translated for Nikita Khrushchev when he met with Charles de Gaulle at the Élysée Palace in Paris. He had seen plenty of impressive buildings. There were many ambitious real estate developers in the United States. Why had Moscow picked Trump? Weeks after his first Trump meeting, Dubinin was named Soviet ambassador to Washington. In The Art of the Deal, Trump writes, "In January 1987, I got a letter from Yuri Dubinin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, that began, 'It is a pleasure for me to relay some good news from Moscow.' Went on to say that the leading Soviet state agency for international tourism, Goskomintourist, had expressed interest in pursuing a joint venture to construct and manage a hotel in Moscow." According to Viktor Suvorov, a former GRU military spy, and others, the KGB ran Interest, the agency to which Trump referred. It functioned as a subsidiary KGB branch. Initiated in 1929 by Stalin, Interest was the Soviet Union's official state travel agency. Its job was to vet and monitor all foreigners coming into the Soviet Union. "In my time, it was KGB," Suvorov said. "They gave permission for people to visit." The KGB's first and second directorates routinely received lists of prospective visitors to the country based on their visa applications. As a GRU operative, Suvorov was personally involved in recruitment, albeit for a rival service to the KGB. Soviet spy agencies were always interested in cultivating young, ambitious people, he said, an upwardly mobile businessman, a scientist, a guy with a future. Once in Moscow, they would receive lavish hospitality. Everything is free. There are good parties with nice girls. It could be a sauna and girls and who knows what else. The hotel rooms or villa were under 24-hour control, with security cameras and so on, Suvorov said. The interest is only one, to collect some information and keep that information about him for the future. These dirty tricks operations were all about the long term, Suvorov said. After 10 or 20 years, some of them would be nobody, but others would have risen to positions of influence in their own countries. Suvorov explained, "It's at this point you say, 'Knock, knock. Do you remember the marvelous time in Moscow? It was a wonderful evening. You were so drunk. You don't remember? We just show you something for your good memory." By January 1987, Trump was closer to the prominent person status of Khrushchev's note. Dubinin deemed Trump interesting enough to arrange his trip to Moscow. Another 30-something US-based Soviet diplomat, Vitaly Churkin, the future UN ambassador, helped put it together. On July 4, 1987, Trump flew to Moscow for the first time, together with Ivana and Lisa Calandra, Ivana's Italian-American assistant. Moscow was, Trump wrote, an extraordinary experience. The Trump stayed in Lenin's suite at the National Hotel at the bottom of Tverskaya Street near Red Square. 70 years earlier, in October 1917, Lenin and his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, had spent a week in room 107. The hotel was linked to the glass and concrete Interest complex next door and was, in effect, under KGB control. The Lenin suite would have been bugged. Meanwhile, the mausoleum containing the Bolshevik leader's embalmed corpse was a short walk away. Other Soviet leaders were interred beneath the Kremlin's wall in a communist pantheon. Stalin, Brezhnev, Andropov, Khrushchev's old mentor, and Dzerzhinsky. According to The Art of the Deal, Trump toured a half-dozen potential sites for a hotel, including several near Red Square. "I was impressed with the ambition of Soviet officials to make a deal," he writes. He also visited Leningrad, later St. Petersburg. A photo shows Donald and Ivana standing in Palace Square, he in a suit, she in a red polka dot blouse with a string of pearls. Behind them are the Winter Palace and the State Hermitage Museum. That July, the Soviet press wrote enthusiastically about the visit of a foreign celebrity. This was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist and journalist. Pravda featured a long conversation between the Colombian guest and Gorbachev. Garcia Marquez spoke of how South Americans, himself included, sympathized with socialism and the USSR. Moscow brought Garcia Marquez over for a film festival. Trump's visit appears to have attracted less attention. There is no mention of him in Moscow's Russian State Library newspaper archive. Either his visit went unreported, or any articles featuring it have been quietly removed. Press clippings do record a visit by a West German official and an Indian cultural festival. The KGB's private dossier on Trump, by contrast, would have gotten larger. The agency's multi-page profile would have been enriched with fresh material, including anything gleaned via eavesdropping. Nothing came of the trip, at least nothing in terms of business opportunities inside Russia. This pattern of failure would be repeated in Trump's subsequent trips to Moscow. But Trump flew back to New York with a new sense of strategic direction. For the first time, he gave serious indications that he was considering a career in politics, not as mayor or governor or senator. Trump was thinking about running for president. In July 1987, Mr. Trump went after the biggest casino of all, the Taj Mahal, which Resorts International, builder of Atlantic City's first casino, was erecting. After buying a controlling interest in Resorts from the estate of its founder, Mr. Trump battled the talk show host Merv Griffin for control of the company. In the end, Mr. Griffin got the company, while Mr. Trump won the still unfinished Taj Mahal. Mr. Trump, while in Paris with his wife on the return trip from Moscow in July 1987, said reaching a deal with the Russians wouldn't be for the money. He would do it for the prestige. Mr. Trump visited Moscow in July 1987. There is not much else in the public record to describe his visit, except Trump's own recollection in The Art of the Deal that Soviet officials were eager for him to build a hotel there. It never happened. Mr. Trump returned from Moscow fired up with political ambition. He began the first of a long series of presidential flirtations, which included a flashy trip to New Hampshire. 2 months after his Moscow visit, Mr. Trump spent almost $100,000 on a series of full-page newspaper ads that published a political manifesto, an open letter from Donald J. Trump on why America should stop paying to defend countries that can afford to defend themselves, as Trump labeled it, launched angry populist charges against the Allies that benefited from the umbrella of American military protection. After World War II, the U.S. had created a liberal international order and underwritten its safety by maintaining the world's strongest military. Why are these nations not paying the United States for the human lives and billions of dollars we are losing to protect their interest? Trump's letter avoided the question of whom the U.S. was protecting those countries from. The primary answer, of course, was the Soviet Union. A central goal of Soviet and later Russian foreign policy was to split the U.S. from its allies. December 9, 1987, Donald Trump attended the State Department lunch with Gorbachev. In the receiving line, Gorbachev asked Trump to build a hotel in Moscow, Trump told reporters. Mr. Trump, interviewed from Moscow in July 1987, said, "They want me to build a great hotel in the Soviet Union where, unfortunately, there are not many great hotels." Speaking of Trump Tower, he said, "Yuri Dubinin suggested that we make a similar architectural statement in Moscow. There are not too many ideas that I become attracted to, but that is one I think would interest a lot of people, not purely from an economic standpoint either." The level of construction sophistication is so high in New York. It could be a problem here. I think the intentions are very good. It's a totally interesting place. Moscow, Russia, 1987. The onion-shaped domes of a Russian church have a beautiful rhythm. When asked if the Trump hotels in the Soviet Union would bear his name, Mr. Trump said, "That hasn't been discussed yet." Mr. Trump said that Soviet regulations on joint ventures required that the Soviets hold a controlling 51% interest. A 51-49 split could cause people such as me a lot of problems, psychological and otherwise. I like to have control, to put it mildly. Can something be done? Who knows? It is really too soon to tell. They may not have the flexibility necessary to get this done. In 1988, Yakov Smirnoff said, "Gorbachev forced me from being a Russian comedian to being a comedian from Russia." All of a sudden, the American public wants to know from me about all the changes happening in the Soviet public. But I was censored by the Department of Jokes. I didn't know they had a Department of Jokes in the Soviet Union. Some things you don't learn in Soviet school. There is apparently much speculation among the Soviet people about the man who left Russia to find fame and fortune in show business. Mr. Smirnoff said, "It's a National Enquirer kind of thing. You know, homeboy made it big, and now Donald Trump is a servant at my house." Mr. Smirnoff, who would be performing at Trump's castle this weekend, said his relatives in Ukraine slightly exaggerated his fame in the United States. "They thought Donald Trump was my driver," said Mr. Smirnoff. "The Americans are a wonderful, naive people. It's a natural thing when you grow up in a comfortable society that does not have fears. It's like growing up in a zoo. You don't know that there's somebody who can kill you if you're being let out, but you can also kill somebody else. They don't want to really feel that some bad guy may be out there to get them. I wish that would have been different here, that people would be a little more cautious and say, 'We have a wonderful country, let's try to keep it going.'" About the coming 1988 election, Mr. Smirnoff said, "Maybe Donald Trump would have been probably better. He's dealt with deficit easier, he just put it on his MasterCard." Mr. Smirnoff said, "Donald Trump should know, before he gets involved in Russia, that what can happen to him in America can happen there. In Russia, we have our Georgia peaches too." Mr. Trump said, "I find I get along better with the construction workers and the cab drivers, the people who count in the world. Working people respect the fact that I built this company by myself." His wife Ivana said, "He's the people's billionaire. You have no idea. Middle-class Americans adore Donald, and I don't know why. They shouldn't. They should resent him. He's young and he's wealthy and he flaunts it." Donald Trump said, "I'm sick and tired of reading about how I buy. Nobody concentrates on the hard work to get the possessions. I built this company by myself." This stunning display took place in August 1987 at lunchtime in the Grand Ballroom of the Grand Hyatt, where each table was striving to go aloft with a batch of red, white, and blue balloons that read, "Don King, only in America." King, the promoter with the understated hairdo, announced that HBO is telecasting this to the whole universe of this nation. Mr. King said that Mike Tyson had come 360 degrees around, and that's the triangle of life. Mr. King saved his most lavish encomiums for Donald Trump, with whom he has entered into a partnership for the upcoming fight. King mentioned the great edifices that Trump, the real estate magnate, had built. He started off about, "That guy in Russia, what's his name?" King turned to Trump, who said it softly. Mr. King said, "Gorbachev, that's right. He asked Donald to redo Russia personally. Oh, woo. Leningrad is spinning in his grave." "Lenin," someone shouted. "Lenin," repeated King triumphantly. Mr. King next spoke about touching the hem of the great man, Trump, and that he was so lost for words to define this man that he had to make up a new one. Telesynergistic. That will go into the lexicons and dictionaries and what have you. What does telesynergistic mean? Mr. King said it has something to do with the kind of genius that can make 2 and 2 add up to 10. When 1989 began, nobody was expecting the world to turn inside out, but then the trembling increased, and the mountains around the Cold War horizon began to wobble and fall over. Polish communism went first, and then Hungary's rulers published an abdication plan. In August, the Baltic republics of the Soviet Union began to demand independence. On August 23, 1989, in one of history's most spectacular and moving events, there assembled a human chain of nearly 2 million men, women, and children standing hand in hand in a line stretching 400 miles across the landscape, from Vilnius through Riga to Tallinn, asking for freedom, justice, and independence. Perhaps a quarter of the entire Baltic population joined the chain. One day early in the fall of 1989, when Mr. Trump and Marla Maples were watching the Trump helicopter take off from Atlantic City, Mr. Trump asked, "Can you believe that I own that? Can you believe that's my name on the side?" October was the decisive month. On October 2, 1989, a huge demonstration calling for reform gathered in Leipzig and decided to keep meeting every Monday until their demands were met. The Leipzig marches defying the police were now attracting hundreds of thousands. Erich Honecker, communist leader of East Germany, threatened to copy the Chinese who had shot hundreds of demonstrators in Tiananmen Square only months earlier. On Monday, October 9, 1989, the real turning point of the revolution, armed militias in Leipzig refused to fire on the crowds. On October 10, 1989, 3 of Donald Trump's top casino executives were killed when their rented helicopter plummeted flying from Manhattan to Atlantic City. Donald Trump and the highest-ranking members of the Trump Organization knew full well that they had been fooling the public about Mr. Trump's business acumen and financial strength. Stephen F. Hyde, 43, who bore responsibility for Trump's 3 Atlantic City casino properties, Taj Mahal top executive Mark G. Itas, 38, and Jonathan Bonneau, 33, executive vice president of Trump Plaza Hotel and Casino, were killed along with the craft's 2 pilots. Less than a month later, Erich Honecker of East Germany was overthrown. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall was breached. The night of September 22, 1940, hundreds of German planes bombed London, the 15th of 57 consecutive nights of the London Blitz, or Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. Also that day, the New York Times announced Nikola Tesla had developed a death beam for planes. In the article, Mr. Tesla described the death ray as a newly discovered teleforce that integrated 4 new inventions. No further information regarding the death beam teleforce had been made public by the time of Nikola Tesla's death in New York City at age 86 on January 7, 1943. Leading the investigation of Mr. Tesla's death, P.E. Foxworth, Assistant Director of the New York FBI office, said the U.S. government was vitally interested in preserving Tesla's papers. Nikola Tesla's papers and research constituted 2 truckloads of materials, 80 trunks, and a safe. Mr. Tesla's nephew in New York City, Sava Kostanovic, Yugoslav ambassador to the U.S., filed a petition in surrogate court. A search had disclosed that several years will be required in cataloging, indexing, and examining papers and data to ascertain the scope, meaning, and significance thereof. 2 days after Tesla's death, representatives of the Office of Alien Property, OAP, seized all of his possessions. OAP was the department of the U.S. government that officially served as the custodian for enemy property. Dr. John G. Trump, an electrical engineer with the National Defense Research Committee of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, was brought in to analyze the Tesla papers in OAP custody. Following his 3-day investigation, Dr. Trump said, Tesla's thoughts and efforts during at least the past 15 years were primarily of a speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional character, often concerned with production and wireless transmission of power, but did not include new, sound, workable principles or methods for realizing such results. For 9 years, the personal effects, plans, writing, research, and files of Nikola Tesla were held in a Manhattan warehouse on 59th Street in New York City. In 1952, the U.S. government finally released 60 of the trunks containing Nikola Tesla's papers and possessions to his nephew Sava Kostanovic in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, where a museum was created in the inventor's honor. The remaining 20 trunks of Nikola Tesla's final archives and any copies of the papers have disappeared. No one in the U.S. government has said what happened to them. In the years and decades following World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested in the development of beam weapon technology. By the late 1970s, the Americans feared that the Soviets had achieved a breakthrough. The American response to this technological surprise was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. The SDI, nicknamed the Star Wars program, urged teams of U.S. government scientists to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. President Ronald Reagan announced the program in 1983, the same year that Dr. John G. Trump received the National Medal of Science. But when the Pentagon assembled the teams of scientists to actually develop the Star Wars program's death rays, Dr. John G. Trump refused to help. In a 1988 article in Science for the People, MIT colleague James Melcher said, John, over a period of 3 decades, would be approached by people of all sorts because he could make megavolt beams of ions and electrons, death rays. What did he do with this knowledge? Cancer research, sterilizing sludge, all sorts of wondrous things. He didn't touch the weapon stuff. The The U.S. government spent billions on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Negotiating teams for the United States and Soviet Union agreed to reductions in the number of nuclear missiles, including in due course the elimination of intermediate-range missiles, but the negotiations were haunted by SDI. In 1986, Reagan famously walked out on a one-on-one negotiating session when Mr. Gorbachev attempted to make what turned out to be one last demand that the United States abandon SDI. The Star Wars program's 1988 budget of $5.7 billion exceeded that of both NASA, $4.7 billion, and the National Science Foundation, $1.7 billion. In January 1989, George H.W. Bush succeeded Reagan as president. By then, the price of oil, Moscow's principal export, had plummeted to around $10 a barrel, and the Soviet Union was essentially bankrupt. Mr. Gorbachev canvassed the world for a life-preserving loan of $15 billion annually. As a last resort, he called Mr. Bush and pleaded for help, but Mr. Bush replied that he had to assure Congress that any potential debtor was credit-worthy, and he could not say this about the USSR. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall was demolished by German demonstrators. Mr. Gorbachev's support to lead the Soviet Union dwindled. On August 24, 1991, after a failed coup attempt, Mr. Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of its Communist Party. On December 25, 1991, Mr. Gorbachev resigned as President of the USSR. The end of the Soviet Union came on December 31, 1991. America had prevailed. The Soviet Union was no more. In 1993, the Pentagon's Strategic Defense Initiative Agency was dissolved. On July 4, 1987, Soviets experienced their first rock concert with performances by James Taylor, Bonnie Raitt, the reunited Doobie Brothers, and Santana. Carlos Santana said, "It's not a wrestling match to prove that the American way is better. We should work together to declare war on poverty and ignorance, not against each other." The show ended with all the Russian and American musicians joining on stage for the Doobies' "Listen to the Music." Whoa, whoa, listen to the music. Like a lazy flowing river surrounding castles in the sky. And the crowd is growing bigger, listening for the happy sounds. July 5, 1987, the Miami Herald reported that Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North helped draft a plan to impose martial law in the United States in the event of an emergency. It was to apply in the event of a crisis like nuclear war, violent and widespread internal dissent, or opposition to a U.S. military invasion abroad. The secret plan called for suspension of the Constitution, turning control of the government over to the little-known Federal Emergency Management Agency, appointment of military commanders to run state and local governments, and the declaration of martial law. Asked what may come next for Oliver North, Washington political consultant Roger Stone answered, "Whatever he wants. He's going to get so many offers." On July 14, 1987, John Margolis reported that New Hampshire Republican Mike Dunbar had the blessing of Donald Trump to gather the 1,000 signatures needed to get him on the ballot in the state that holds the first presidential primary. Mr. Trump, registered as a Democrat since the Carter administration, changed his registration to Republican. July 17, 1987, Greg Dawson said, "It's looking more and more as if Fox Broadcasting Company is a real attempt at a television network, and not just the world's biggest tax write-off for sugar daddy and founder Rupert Murdoch." In 1984, Oliver North helped draft a plan to impose martial law in the United States in event of emergency. Mr. North's proposal would radically alter American government by executive order in a time of crisis. Didn't any moral bell go off in your head? The prosecutor, John W. Kecker, questioned Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Wasn't there anything from your upbringing, your moral training, your Marine background that told you, this does not seem right? Oliver North said, I was raised to know the difference between right and wrong. I knew it wasn't right not to tell the truth on these things, but I didn't think it was unlawful. What I'm going to say next, please let me say again, is only my opinion. In my opinion, it was all intentional. In my opinion, our democracy is being subverted, and that's why I made this video. No doubt Mr. Trump will deny it until his dying day. Haven't we learned by now not to listen to what he says, but to look at what he does? Roy Cohn has demoralized, and Donald Trump is demoralizing America, and that was what they wanted to do. The norm breaking that plays up divisions, tribalizes, and shreds our social contract, that is their bottom line. That's the goal. In the Cold War, Russia never envisioned a nuclear annihilated America in the future. They were always focused on a weakened, controllable, disunited states. There has been an ongoing attack on American institutions and morals from the inside since the end of World War II. Roy Cohn fixing the Rosenberg executions, McCarthyism, corrupting public transportation, the first hostile corporate takeover, and then near destruction of the Lionel Train Corporation, the court battles, the political gossip, prenuptial agreements, cheating on taxes, continuing to be sexually active with AIDS. Donald Trump wrecking a professional football league, the consumerism, junk bonds, buying 1, then 2, then 3 casinos in Atlantic City. The third casino wasted more than $1 billion just in construction, rounds and rounds of bankruptcies, cheating on taxes, the housing market crash, the birtherism, child separation, spreading the coronavirus willfully. In my opinion, our democracy is being subverted. Donald J. Trump has been an adversary of the United States of America for decades. That's why I made this video. In his 1993 book, Quoth the Maven, William Safire said disinformation was used by the KGB to indicate manipulation of a nation's intelligence system through the injection of credible but misleading data. Former Romanian secret police senior official Ihan Mihai Pasipa wrote about disinformation history in his book, Disinformation, in 2013. Mr. Pasipa recounted reading Soviet instruction manuals while working as an intelligence officer that characterized disinformation as a strategy used by the Russian government that had early origins in Russian history. In the old Soviet manuals, it said the origins of disinformation stemmed from phony towns constructed by Grigory Potemkin to wow Catherine the Great during her journey to the region, subsequently referred to as Potemkin villages. This was back in 1793 on the Crimean Peninsula. The story of American disinformation begins on the Crimean Peninsula in 1945. The 2012 documentary series, The Untold History of the United States, written by Oliver Stone and historian Peter Kuznick, and narrated and directed by Mr. Stone, explores the origin of the Cold War. Historian Ronald Radosh traced the Stone and Kuznick version of the origin story of the Cold War back to Karl Marzani's book, We Can Be Friends. We Can Be Friends was published in 1952. It was later revealed through evidence from the Verona decryptions that Mr. Marzani was a Soviet operative working for the department that became the KGB. This book was the first example of what is now a whole genre called Cold War revisionism. The back and forth between historians got me interested in taking a closer look at FDR, Churchill, and Stalin's meeting at Yalta. February 4th to 11th, 1945. The Big Three met on the Crimean Peninsula, due in part to Mr. Stalin's fear of flying. At Yalta, the Big Three agreed to more than newly redrawn borders and boundaries. They agreed that people had a right to self-determination regarding their own government. In the humble opinion of the video maker, and I promise this is the final time I break the third wall in this already too long video. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. The origin of the Cold War was right after the Yalta Agreement was signed. The Russians had lied when they agreed at Yalta that the people had a right to self-determine their government. But it was a meaningless falsehood in their worldview. They would call it naive to say otherwise, a little white lie that shaded enough of a gray area for future Soviet gains. The Russians had agreed only to the appearance of democratic institutions, which could be subverted in bad faith to further their interests. FDR and Churchill shared and seemed to sometimes project onto others Western values, belief in the rule of law, the Constitution, our democratic institutions, Christian morals, whereas the Russians approached geopolitics as a zero-sum game. Joseph Stalin made it known that he had signed the accord in bad faith. Back in the USSR, when Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov expressed his concern that the Yalta Agreement's wording would be an obstacle to their plans, Mr. Stalin said, "Never mind, we'll do it our own way later." The bottom line would be who your friends and enemies were, not self-determination or a subjective definition of truth or fairness. Power was loyalty, loyalty was power. Following the Yalta Agreement, Russian subversion affected elections in Poland on January 16, 1947, and in the United States on November 8, 2016.